We heard a lot yesterday about the potential of AI and the challenges and threats that were brought on by the development of AI. And so I'm really excited to have Kenneth Cukier here to lend his voice to that broader conversation with a provocative look really at whether journalism can survive AI in the era of big data. Kenneth is a senior editor for digital products at The Economist and co-author of the best-selling Big Data, A Revolution That Will Transform How We Live, Work, and Think. I think this quote from an interview with Ken on the TED Radio Hour sort of sums up the urgency of the challenge we'll be talking about today. Privacy was the central challenge in a small data era. In the big data era, the challenge will be safeguarding free will, moral choice, human volition, and human agency. No small task. He's worked as a foreign correspondent for nearly 2 decades and was a research fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And he hosts a weekly podcast on technology, and his TED Talk on AI has been downloaded more than 1 million times. So please welcome Kenneth, all yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So you can hear me, I hope. I can't hear you. Jim, just let me know, can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you well. So
everyone can hear me, that's great. Now, in this instance, strangely, as opposed to when we tested it, I have a weird feedback in my ear. So maybe the people doing the IT can get rid of the feedback. So I'm also turning down my volume, so you'll still be able to hear me. I won't be able to hear you so well. So if you need to interrupt me, you have to shout. Okay. So as Jim pointed out, this is a huge topic, and it's one where you've actually looked at the issue before, maybe on the optimistic side yesterday, thinking about how AI can be a tool for journalists and how it can help journalism. And I actually think it can. In fact, I'm certain it can, and it'll do great things. However, what's received too little attention is the fact that data and AI are actually threatening journalism in ways that we haven't really thought about or given enough thought about as media professionals. So next slide, please. So what you're looking at right now may be familiar to some of you. It is a homepage with lots of links to it. It's a media site, although it's not a media site that we know, like The Economist or The Wall Street Journal. And what's overlaying it is a display, an overlaid display with numbers. And those numbers identify what are the most popular articles. The data is coming from Chartbeat, if you will, the analysis, the analytics there, Chartbeat. And the small little Chartbeat logo is at the very bottom. And many websites now, media websites, use either Omniture or Chartbeat or something else, Google Analytics, with which to analyze their traffic. Now, in some instances, if you're using Google Analytics, often you're doing it after the fact. But in things like Chartbeat, it's a real-time measurement. So you can identify what is the most popular story and what is the least popular. So interestingly, on the left-hand side, what you'll notice is that there's a story that's in the red that's kind of not very popular at the very top. And although, to be sure, the bigger items on the right-hand side that are much thicker are very popular. The top one is actually the second one down. What's interesting about this is that I remember in 2015 looking at the Economist homepage with Chartbeat after we put it in, and I noticed something sort of interesting. We had the large variety of things that we normally have on our website, but I noticed that there was an article for Trump running for president that was way lower down, far lower down, below the fold, in effect, on the homepage. Yet was the second most popular site, second most popular story. And what's interesting about that is that you could already see back then that something interesting was going on, not just with Trump, but with media. That suddenly you had a lens into what your audience was doing and consuming in a way that you couldn't do it before. And that was certainly going to affect decisions as an editor in terms of where and what stories you assign. Next slide, please. So let's remember that this is actually a very big change, right? it was in many of our own professional lifetimes. I'm in my late 40s. We remember an era in which editors made all the decisions using their instinct and their judgment and their values in terms of where they put stories on. People had to go to the news rather than the news than finding them. They had to pay for it. It was a very different mediascape. Now, in 2012, Obama was using the internet for running a campaign, but he was using it for fundraising. A shift that took place was that by 2016, the internet, in a way, and artificial intelligence around it, had accidentally become weaponized. And we can talk about that, but was used in a much more muscular way to influence what people saw and what they thought about things. Next slide, please. And so it was a surprise to many people, but not entirely, that Donald Trump from out of nowhere could actually claim the presidency. The media created him as the candidate, and it wasn't because different editors were saying, this is an important story, let's put it on page one. In many respects, he was attracting this attention through this chaotic information landscape simply because the algorithms were giving him that attention, that visibility that another candidate wouldn't have gotten because it was just so peculiar and it was so unique and novel. Now, there was, of course, a real outpouring of support by people to his candidacy, but it was coming from the clicks, and the algorithms were not actually optimizing, say, for public understanding or for integrity or for mission and for appropriateness for the office. It was simply optimizing for clicks, for popularity. And so there was a snowball effect that I think the media now is looking at and saying, hey, did we do anything? Well, they sort of didn't because the media was asleep on the switch. The editors typically aren't the ones who implement the tools and interact with the tools. What's happening is the geeks are doing this, and the editors are sort of, if they're still there in the newsroom, are doing something else. And they don't realize that these two systems are going on in parallel. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do today is simply talk about maybe these three phases of how big data and media have intersected. Now, what is the definition of big data or AI? Very concisely, it means this. We can measure things that we couldn't measure before. We can measure things in real time that we couldn't measure before. And when you collect a large body of data, you can do things that you couldn't do when you're only working with smaller amounts. But the change in scale leads to a change in state. Now, artificial intelligence is simply basically finding patterns from large bodies of data to actually do very specific things, not because you know what the right answer is, but because you can infer what the right answer is. And all you need to do as a coder is to identify a recursive system of collecting more data to actually infer what these answers are without being able to specify it perfectly. So now that we have big data and artificial intelligence in our newsrooms through the tools that we're using, like Chartbeat, what has been the effect? Well, let's look at the past, just the very recent past first. Next slide, please. And the recent past was basically typified by the internet bubble and by revenue destruction. This is the context that we're in. Next slide, please. So the internet bubble was a term coined by Eli Pariser in his book by the same name. And it's the idea that the systems learn so much about us that it tailors its interactions with us and gives us things that we like. If I'm writing about Turkey and it's around November, well, I might be searching for, if I'm Googling it, I might be looking for the animal because I want to cook it and eat it. Turkey is American Thanksgiving. But if I'm searching for Turkey and it's in the middle of the winter and I've just been searching for Langkawi and the Bahamas, it might know that I'm looking for a vacation spot and it show me actually the country of Turkey. The systems work that way. And likewise, if you're always searching for one thing versus another, it will shape and tailor to make more relevant, it's more valuable to you, what you're getting on a search engine. But it's happening all throughout the internet, not just on search engines, and it's happening in media sites as well. So what you're looking at right now is actually the network graph of users on Twitter who have followed Republican sites and Democratic sites. And what you're seeing is that they cluster very highly. There's very little crosstalk between the two, and in fact, very little purple, suggesting that in fact this effect of the internet bubble of an atomized and fragmented media sphere in which people are in their own little clusters and they're not communicating is a typical classical way that media is happening now. So you've got the Fox News readers on one side, you've got the New York Times readers on another. They're almost in very separate realities. Next slide, please. And this is within the context of the fact that the media has been collapsing for a variety of reasons, but largely because of the large web platforms taking all of the income and profitability from media for itself, rather than being able to distribute it to the journalists. So you've got newsrooms that are crunched for staff. They can't afford the editors as much. Often when they're buying in analytics, it's as a cost-saving measure to know what's more popular rather than less popular, to change their websites. And what's interesting here is that local news used to be the most profitable form of media, had a monopoly on targeting that local demographic, and it knew something about its audience. But because the web platforms are basically surveillance capitalism, knowing what's happening on their web platforms, local news has actually become the least profitable and the least powerful form of advertising. So all the profits are gone. So although we've had a crisis in media, it's not been a crisis in the national news media as much as it has been for the local news media, which of course, as you know, is a lot more important for people's day-to-day life, because although we do need to know about North Korea, you really need to know about corruption at City Hall. Next slide, please. So what does the situation look like today? Well, based on these features, we've now shifted into the world of Chartbeat, right? In which we have algorithms, not editors making decisions, and you've got fake news and content ads that are psychographic in nature happening as well. Next slide, please. So this is the New York Times, and this is the New York Times homepage from a few days ago, and everything on it has been decided by an editor, not too dissimilarly from how it looked basically 100 years ago. This is what they've chosen to show to their readers. Next slide, please. But other sites, in this case the Washington Post, just a little bit lower down, have this idea of the most read, and they're rendering what's visible, which was the most popular. Next slide, please. But the homepage is actually kind of a fiction, because we all know that only about maybe, if we're lucky, 20% of our traffic actually goes to the homepage. And it's usually not the first visit, it's usually the second. What they're doing is people are coming through the side door of the article. And when they come in through the article, well, what's on page 1 of the article? Well, most read is the most common. This is the Wall Street Journal from last night. Keep in mind that in the past, when you had to actually go to a newspaper, it was largely impossible for you to pick it up and read anything in it without actually seeing what was on the front page. The front page effect was actually extraordinarily powerful in American politics, because you didn't even need to buy the paper. You could walk by the newsagent, or every time you were getting your coffee at a coffee shop, you would see some papers lying about and you would look at the front page. That's why it was so important that editors depicted and framed what they wanted to talk about so well in that one space. But the front page is largely gone now on a digital setting. When you're looking at through your mobile phone, you come through Twitter or other social media, and you then click on the article, and then you might go somewhere else. And here it's showing that you're optimizing for, in this case, algorithmically, what was popular, other clicks, rather than values. Next slide, please. If on one side the problem is that we have algorithms that are making news judgments rather than editors, the second problem is the area of fake news, where on the platforms, they weren't even looking at whether anything was accurate or not. Now, I know we can all sound like journalists are whinging when we talk about this. This is not a whinge, right? This is not just a complaint. This is just a dispassionate look at the environment of media and how it's changed. And we can say that it's actually a problem. Normatively, it's actually quite destructive. But it's not that we're complaining. It's that in the whole point of the professionalization of journalism that took place in the 20th century was one where we put extra care and we built institutional practices and safeguards, and everything from the point of how we trained young journalists to how we sanctioned them if someone did something wrong in a newsroom, to ensure that we avoided just these sorts of spurious pieces of information because we understood that what we did was very important for having a well-working democracy. But here, as you can see, the platforms didn't actually have those safeguards, and they still don't, and they're trying to build it in. And maybe AI could actually be a way to enable us to identify fake news and then to shimmy it out of the system and make it less visible. But at least for the moment, what happened was in the most previous election, and also for Brexit and for other, in the last 3 years of the online media world, these completely inaccurate and highly partisan sorts of pieces of information were being floated up by the algorithm. Next slide, please. And what's also quite interesting is that it's not even the journalism, right? You could actually do it through the advertising network. And that's what we learned through the Cambridge Analytica scandal and with Facebook, is what they were serving up to people was not actually items of content. They did some of that too, but it was actually using the advertising system. And why would you use the advertising system? Because that was the system that was most created to actually know something about the person that you can then identify that this person is a partisan, for Republican causes. You don't know they're Republican, but you do know that they're probably a white male in the middle of the United States. They've been searching for a pickup truck, and maybe they've been actually going to gun shows, and you know this as well through the system. So the ad network was actually the most extraordinary way with which you'd be able to target these messages that you couldn't before. Messages that really don't even have to swing Republican or Democrat, messages that simply will rile people up, right? About, say, an issue, like a hot button issue like immigration. And that's exactly how it was used. Next slide, please. So what's the world going to look like tomorrow? If we've identified these harms or these pathologies of big data and artificial intelligence that have been creeping into the newsroom, tomorrow's going to look a little bit scarier still. Next slide, please. So artificial intelligence is able to, as we know, to do extraordinary things to identify trends in data. But when it's identifying trends in data, it can actually do that in a myriad of ways. And so what you're seeing here is a technique called face swapping, and there's also voice cloning. And what it's doing is it's being able to identify the pixels of the gesture of a actor's face and then place it onto the target face of, say, George Bush or of Vladimir Putin, and that same gestures of their mouth or eventually their body and other features will actually then appear by changing the pixels. Again, it's just simply a data analysis at an incredibly robust scale mechanism. It will be able to actually have people look to be saying things that they really say in terms of their gestures. Adding in with voice cloning, if you take really maybe about 10 minutes of someone's speech, you have enough, and you break it down, you salami slice it into the little word and vowel and consonant blocks. You could then have them say, and also word blocks, you'd have them say things that they never really said, but it would sound like their real voice. And as the technology improves, it's going to be harder to detect. Next slide, please. So what this is going to mean for the future is going to be quite extraordinary, whether we understand if the news is legitimate or not, or if it's completely invented. Now, as I say this, I realize that the media doesn't wrap itself in glory in terms of how it's interacted with the news before. In this case, this is a photograph of a screenshot of CNN during the Gulf War, or I should say Operation Desert Storm in the 90s. But what's interesting is that what I was looking for was this very classical photograph of the anchor of CNN wearing a gas mask and a flak jacket, while all the film crew around him were wearing T-shirts and cut-off jeans, showing that, in fact, what he was presenting to himself as a hero war correspondent was and under danger was not the reality at the time. And so the media has to improve its practices as well. We can't think that we're holier than thou, that in fact this is a problem that's endemic. Next slide, please. So what are the implications of this somewhat dispiriting talk about big data and what it means for the future of media? Well, I think that the future of media is going to look a little bit like the old media of the 19th century in the West, which was a very chaotic cacophony of information, and you couldn't really trust pretty much anything. But what did come from that was by the beginning of the 20th century, there were some standards like the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times and others were emerging. And by the mid-20th century, there had been a professionalization of media. So I see that new media is going to look like old. In fact, that the world is going to be very chaotic in terms of its information scape. But only a few brands are going to be the ones who will be able to invest in fact-checking and the technology to ascertain that things are legitimate and that people are really going to trust. And there might only be 3 or 4 or 5 of these top-tier global media brands that people trust. Okay, so if that's the case, that's a bad thing for several reasons. One is that it means that these national or international news companies are the ones that are the top tier. That's good for people if you're a news consumer. It's bad if you care about local journalism and sort of national journalism, because they won't have the resources to actually fulfill their mission. And that's a problem. But also at this top end, we don't want 5 great, however we'll take any great news organization, thank you very much. But we really don't want a concentration of power of top news brands. That too is a problem, and we should be troubled by it. The question then becomes, who will hold these media brands to account? It's ironic that the internet was meant to democratize media, when in fact what I'm describing is one in which that looks a lot like the mid-20th century model of, say, 3 television networks and 1 or 2 major national dailies. So too, you might have just 5 nationally top-tier brands and then a long tail of who knows what. Right? I think there'll be actually some extraordinary media companies in that long tail as well, but they're just not going to have the muscular power because they won't have the visibility and the presence online because they don't have the financing to enable them to have that. So it's a real problem. Who's going to hold media to account? Can it be the public, which of course has always been the great hope because we are in the service of the public? However, as much as these trends in terms of data affect the future of media, we can't lose sight of what is probably the biggest problem. Next slide, please. And that is a loss of sovereignty. In the past, if you had enough money to buy a radio transmitter and get a license, or you had the printing presses and the paper and the delivery trucks and the deals with the news agents, you could become a media company and you could actually have an important presence in your community and also maybe in your country, maybe even globally. But today, the media companies have lost their sovereignty, they've lost their control, their ability to do that because they all have to go through platforms that are owned by other parties. Those other parties can deliberately knock out their traffic one day to the next. But that's not what they're doing. These other platforms are just looking at content and treating the cat video like the war correspondent. And that's a problem, obviously, because inadvertently they can knock out the traffic and it could actually disrupt how a media company does its job in terms of how it hires staff, invests in the future, grows organically into new markets. And so this is a big problem, and we don't yet know how to handle that as a profession, but we must come to some answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, for such a provocative presentation. As you pointed out, you paint a pretty grim future for journalists and media companies, a pretty troubling future in some ways. I want to ask, are media companies or any media companies really prepared and making preparations for this future, how to deal with it, both to meet the challenges, I guess, and seize any opportunities also that might be out there for them?
It's a great question, Jim. And the most important is that most media companies are just trying to make money, right? They're just trying to stay afloat, and we can always respect that. Beyond that, what I do see is New York Times has really put a flagpole in the sand to be the premier digital news media company in the world. No one else has the resources or the scale or the values and the ambition to take on that task. They could, right? Wall Street Journal could. It's owned by Murdoch. That's not his business model. The Washington Post has made extraordinary strides in this new era under the leadership of Bezos. And of course, the story behind that is using data effectively. So he's in effect, Bezos has saved the Washington Post. It's doing better than it has in a decade. However, other than those three American news organizations, there's the irony of it being American, but it's just about resources and power and about interaction with technology. Other than that, I don't see a company that has laid out its shingle in front of its store to say, hey, this is what we plan to do in terms of interacting with new technologies to, say, verify news that it's not fake news, that to verify if there's a video stream that comes through that's not been photoshopped in AI in this new world. So what will that mean in the future? I think that there'll be other great news organizations around the world that will try to do something similar, but of course, it needs scale, it needs presence, and it needs the capital to do that. You'll have much smaller organizations that are going to be able to use these technologies really effectively, far better than one of the top media brands, because the top media brands ultimately have to be conservative in terms of what they do. They've got a business model, they don't want to jeopardize it. If you can use these new data analytical technologies to improve your coverage and to tailor what you're doing for your readers in a very positive way, that's a valuable thing. And so I think we will see the upsides of these, even though I don't immediately see it today.
Great. We have time, I think, for a couple of questions. So from the audience, does anybody have any? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, if you could come to the mic, it'd be great. Yeah, if there are other questions, come ahead and line up.
Rebecca Trigger from ABC News Australia. Do you think we can afford as news organisations to wait for platform distributors like Google and Facebook to change or alter their algorithms to try to make sure trusted news is put forward? Or what do we need to do as an agency to basically ensure that our content is made available to the public?
Great question. I'd like to say that there would be a great marketplace or a sort of value-driven place for us to knock on the door of these organizations and say, do the right thing, and that they would. But I think that's a fantasy. And I think that for us to interact with them as a business to business, is also not worthwhile because the difference in scale is just far too great. So I think actually the only thing to do is to call our politicians and say, we've got to identify what would be the workable, meaningful regulation that would get them to compel proper behaviors and safeguards and invest in the verification, assertion of information that they put forward, not with a human being with a microscope, looking at it, but for example, if the domain name of the site was created in the last, 4 minutes or 4 days, the information should not be privileged as high as it coming from another, ABC News in Australia. So we can do that, but I think also it's going to be not just regulation; it's also going to be the threat of regulation. So I would actually argue, call the politicians and come up with 2 policies. One plan that you dangle in front of them and maybe whack them over the head with, and then the other is the one that you really are willing to do because it's a little bit more of a compromisal situation. But I think the threat of regulation hopefully will get them to do good behavior.
Over there. I think, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We have time for one question, I think.
Sure. Hi, Glenn from Van Media Group here in Singapore. We had a thought-provoking presentation yesterday from the Vice President of Tencent on the AI Dream Writer software. And while there's obviously great potential to take care of mundane journalism tasks, there's also a lot of questions about who would control the AI and what would be blocked from it or added to it, et cetera. From your perspective, how could that technology be used appropriately but also safeguarded?
So I'm not actually 100% certain of what the technology is. Can you describe it in a sentence more?
Sure, I'm not a technologist in this sense, but my understanding, for example, it could take data sets and write, for example, simple sports stories with scores and things like that, and,
sure. Oh, right.
and it could assemble videos. It can do everything within seconds.
Yeah, so I actually think this is great because there's a lot of areas, well, it's great, but I also think it's going to be the Full Employment Act of journalists as well. I don't think we have to worry so much. Maybe not the Full Employment Act, but it's not so much a worry. So why it's great is that in media, we always know that we really only covered maybe 1/100th, 1/1,000,000th of all the things that would be worthy of coverage. So the classic example is like Little League scores. Yeah, we had the great newspapers writing about all of the what the New York Yankees were doing, but all of Grandma and Grandpa always want to read about how little Jimmy played baseball in his little school Little League, and they never got that story. They wouldn't know. They'd have to hear on the telephone from someone else. So you could actually, if the cost of producing journalism goes down to basically nothing, you can imagine that we can grow the market by satiating a demand that we weren't even aware of, because although there's only, say, 8 people in the world who really care about this, they're intensely care. They would actually interact with it and like it, and so they would actually watch that or read this. So it's actually, I think, a very good thing to enable us to do this, as well as things like the classic one with the financial reporting and earnings reports, or the mid-market day moves, right, that all the financial reporters early had to do. All of that was just, it wasn't really, it was time-consuming, but it wasn't high-quality journalism, and it was just really an apprenticeship moment for the journalists before they moved on to the other things. I don't think that that's in competition either with great journalism of what we do when a human being looks at an issue and tries to see their way through it from beginning to end and then communicate it to someone else. So I think that there's a great benefit of using these tools to satiate one part of the market, but I don't think it's going to be as good as having a human being do it for areas in which they've brought more value to the task by thinking through it in a much more creative way.
Great. That's all we have time for, and thanks a lot, Ken.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everyone.